Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be here. It's always difficult to give a talk right after lunch when you all have your postprandial reactions, but I will be loud and controversial if I can. But I first want to thank the organizing committee, especially to Clive, for inviting me to be with you. It is always a pleasure to rejoin you in CCAS and to be a part of the process. So let me start out with, this was the title I was given, Treatment as Prevention. Is anyone listening? And I said, well, I don't know what that really means. And so I changed that title to really, how are we doing? And I'm going to put a specific focus on the Caribbean, since you all hail from this region. So the objectives of my talk will be to review the global epidemiology of HIV/AIDS, set up STEN, and go over the recent trends in HIV transmission. But I really want to go into the successes and challenges in implementing and scaling up treatment as prevention. How did we get there, and how are we doing in terms of that scale up? And what are those measurements? I have no conflicts of interest, since I work for the US government, not allowed to. In any event, let me start off where Deanna sort of gave an introduction, and that is the global pandemic. So I have a lot of thanks to UNAIDS for providing much of this material. This was just released, the numbers, in July. So they're only a month old since their release. Cesar, thank you. And here are the numbers: 36.7 million people living with HIV, incidence 1.8 million people in 2016, and 1 million deaths, despite all the great medications and drugs that we have. This is the list from UNAIDS for every region. And so I highlighted the Caribbean here, and again, Deanna and Clive both talked about these. 310,000 people living with AIDS, HIV, 18,000 newly infected people last year, and 9,400 fatalities as a result of this disease. The fact is, the advances that have been made, and CCAS has seen this over the decades, the most important advances have really been in the development and implementation of antiretroviral drugs, in the impact they have had on survival. We have over 30 different drug combinations at this point, and there's new drugs in the pipeline. It's an absolute phenomenon that the biomedical advances have moved so quickly in a way to get these drugs to bear. And if you look at life survival, this is not a fatal disease. Those deaths, the 1 million deaths we were just talking about, should not be occurring because you don't need to die from HIV/AIDS. In fact, people who get put on those antiretroviral drugs can live almost to the same life expectancy as a person without HIV. So truly phenomenal success in the provision of these drugs. The second big success was getting those drugs into countries that could not afford them to begin with. And the tipping point for that was year 2000 in the Durban AIDS Conference, when it was clear that HIV/AIDS was a disease of inequity, that the haves could get their drugs and could survive, and the have-nots could not. That all changed when it hit the Global Security Council of the United Nations. The Global Fund for HIV/AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria was developed, and then the US got involved through the legislation of PEPFAR, President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief. When all these funds came together, you can see we went from really less than 1 million people on HIV treatment to now over 18 million people. We still need to get up to the 30 million that is targeted for 2020, but for right now, 2016, 18 million people, we're sort of on target. It's really looking good, and I thought I'd show you the UNAIDS target. So it's the dot. The dot is 2020, should have 30 million people on treatment. This is the scale up from year 2000 after the Durban conference. And you can see we're pretty close to on target. Now, we're going to have to maintain funding and finances to get there, but I'm optimistic. That's my nature to be optimistic, and I actually think we're making great advances. And as in the bars, as those drugs are reaching more and more people, mortality is decreasing globally. Some places more than others, and that's dependent on the outreach for getting people on drugs in a timely fashion. So if we want to focus in on the Caribbean, each of these are broken out by region in the rates of survival and decreased rates of mortality. So the area I wanted to point out, this is the other place where I work, sub-Saharan Africa. You can see the decline in mortality, increase in survival is really quite dramatic. And PEPFAR and Global Fund are really responsible for that. Other regions, not quite so dramatic. And I point out here the Middle East and North Africa. Look at this. And in terms of mortality, it's actually going up, and that's Eastern Europe and Central Asia. Now, the Caribbean's here. So fatalities have been declining in a steady rate. And we'll go through some of those numbers as well as we go through this. So UNAIDS often puts together Latin America and the Caribbean, and you have to tease them out. And fortunately, that's been done. But first, let me show you, because Deanna made a comment last night about incidence in the region. And it is true that incidence, if you look here for Latin America and the Caribbean, it's a very slight increase, very, very slight. But that's because you're lumped together with Latin America. So if we start to tease that out, this is incidence for Latin America up the top and the Caribbean down below. And if you look at your rates, in adults at least, it's actually pretty level. It should be going down, and we're going to talk about how to get it down more. But you're just like the United States in a way. We've been rock solid and have not seen major declines. Where you have succeeded has been in mother-to-infant transmission and controlling that. So this is new HIV infections among children. And here is the Caribbean, here is Latin America. Slight uptick there, which is a little bothersome to me. But you can see, you will, if you maintain this, attain the UNAIDS target of 2020 and elimination of mother-to-infant transmission. A huge success that you can look back on. But keep up the work. Now, the talk is about treatment as prevention. And I thought I'd give a little bit of genesis as to how we came about to really using treatment as prevention. And I got involved back in year 2000 when we were looking at discordant couples in Uganda. And we measured the viral load in the discordant couples of the infected individual. And I keep hitting the wrong button. And as you can see, this is all subjects, both men and women, were being the index individual who was positive, that actually we saw no transmission to their partner if they had an undetectable viral load. To be honest with you, if it was under 1,000 copies per ml, there were no transmissions. And I broke it out for male to female transmission if the male was infected, and if the female was infected. And so it's consistent across the gender range that if you are undetectable, you will not transmit this disease. Now, that's natural acquired suppression. So Mike Cohen and many others, the HPTN, took it a step further by doing a study called HPTN 052, where they took those discordant couples and randomized them to early treatment versus delayed treatment according to CD4, to not starting until they were less than 350. And that's called HPTN 052. And that study, all of you know how successful it was, that there was a suppression of transmission if you were virally suppressed. So that provides public health benefit. There were other studies that the earlier you started treatment for an individual, the longer they would survive, and we just talked about that. That's the individual health benefit. But both together is both public and individual, and it became known as treatment as prevention. Treatment to aid the individual and treatment to prevent transmission from a public health perspective. So I just thought I'd highlight two studies, and then we'll talk about the rollout of treatment as prevention globally and then for the Caribbean. Here is 052. If you're not familiar with it, I can't believe you wouldn't be. But it was over 1,000 couples that got randomized. Overall, a 93% reduction in transmission. In fact, if the partner was once they were virally suppressed, there were no transmissions. So we did the linkage doing sequence analysis, and there were transmissions, but it was in individuals who went outside of their partnership and got infected, but they weren't linked to the individual on treatment. Then came along the partner study. The partner study was a European study, more observational, and they also looked at discordant couples with HIV partner on suppressive ART. Condoms were not used. It's over 888 couples. And the bottom line is no linked transmissions if the index person was virally suppressed. Zero transmission. So that comes back to Clive's comment last night about U equals U. Undetectable means unknown or undetected transmission. So what I always find interesting in this study, published in JAMA by Rogers and colleagues, is the number of sex acts. There was a lot of sex going on in these couples, 58,000 that they could count, and yet no transmission. That's 58,000 condomless sex acts with an infected person who's undetectable. That's incredible. So treatment really does work as a preventive modality. So the bottom line is all these studies came together. WHO has a planning group, and they come out and say, treat all people living with HIV, independent of CD4. Getting everyone on treatment has been the challenge. And that was followed up. This is just to show you where that would fit on the prevention paradigm. This is treating the infected population. All other prevention modalities focus on exposed or unexposed individuals, and we talked about PrEP earlier this morning. Still work going on in vaccines and others. But the one area in prevention that we can focus on the infected person is getting them into treatment to reduce infectivity. And the place where that has succeeded the best, and in fact it was the same true with viral load, that if you could treat a pregnant woman who was HIV infected and got her to be undetectable, she did not transmit to her baby, even if the baby didn't get prophylaxis. Now, we feel we need the prophylaxis the baby anyway, but once again, treatment in a pregnant woman reduces her ability to transmit to the baby. And when we look at regions again, and this is by year, so I'll get you oriented to this slide. So 2010, 2011, 2012 is color-coded here. And I highlight once again, you're grouped together again with Latin America. And you can see that in terms of getting women onto antiretroviral drugs to prevent vertical transmission, actually, you're at a tie with Eastern and Southern Africa, where PEPFAR has really provided all the resources and Global Fund. But you're at over 85% of pregnant women accessing treatment. And my hat off to you, because that is really a great success story. If you look at some of the other areas of the world, the Middle East, Asia and Pacific, Eastern Europe, and other places, it's much, much lower. And they are holding back in terms of getting treatment to all those individuals. So this is a similar graphic that I showed you before, just broken out. This is looking at numbers of new infections in the Caribbean. This is your rate, and once again, sort of flat. And we're going to talk about that even more. But your big success, this is the number of new infections in children in the Caribbean, and you can see it's really down almost to elimination stage. So I would encourage you to keep up that fascinating work and to reach a full success in preventing the next generation of HIV infection. I always love to show this slide because it shows children that hopefully we will prevent HIV getting into that population. So last night again, we talked a little bit about what countries are starting to adopt treat all, independent of CD4. And it's hard to tell from this graphic. I just point out that St. Kitts and Nevis, for some reason, either it's no data or it's still less than 350. But most of the other countries in the Caribbean that data has been collected, most of them have moved on to adopting the treatment as prevention and independent of CD4 as to when to start. And as I heard from Clive, I think Barbados was one of the first to move in that direction. So that all leads to a target. And the target, I often ask the experts in the field, where'd that come from? Why do we believe 90-90-90 is truly going to eliminate HIV transmission? And it really comes from models, mathematical models that have looked at this, because at the time it got developed, not one country, not one population really attained a 90-90-90. Now that is changing, but again, all of you know this information, but just to get us into the talk and to get us oriented, it's getting 90% of your HIV-infected population to be diagnosed. And of those that are diagnosed, it's getting 90% of them to be on treatment. And of those on treatment, it's getting 90% to be virally suppressed. There are different ways of showing this information. And this is another graphic, again, set up by UNAIDS. And here are the HIV-infected population that we just talked about, 36.9 million people. So the first target globally is to have 33 million of those people to know their diagnosis. Then to get linked into care, so that then drops down to being 29 million on ART. And remember, the goal for 2020 was to get 30 million onto treatment. So that's where that 30 million comes from. And then of those that are on treatment, to get 27 million people to be virally suppressed. But overall, it's saying that 73% of this number should be virally suppressed. So we can come up with estimates of how many people are infected. If you want to attain 90-90-90, the most important parameter is this, making sure 73% are virally suppressed, because that's what decreases transmission. So let's take a look again at where we are as of end of 2016, when UNAIDS presented these data in just this past July in Paris. So people living with HIV who know their status. So we said it was 37 million people globally are infected. About 70% know their HIV status. That's the best estimate. So there's a gap to getting up to that 90 of 7.5 million more people. And then if we look at people living on, with HIV on treatment, it's about 53%, just over half. So we have a ways to go to get to that 90, 90, 90. And in terms of viral suppression, globally it's 44%. And remember, we need to have that number be 73% if we're going to stop transmission more effectively. So once again, I want to highlight Latin America and the Caribbean as to where you are. First, lumping you together and looking at the 90-90 figures. So once again, here is the first 90. About 75% of the people know their HIV status. About 55% of those individuals are on treatment, and 41% of those on treatment are virally suppressed. So big gaps, but again, most of you are from the Caribbean, so I want to move into separating out the data. So here is the progress, again, for both the Latin American and Caribbean. And again, I'm giving you the numbers two ways. So the 90-90-90 is up here. These are the goals. 90% need to know their virals, whether they're infected. 81% should be on treatment, and 73% of the total number should be virally suppressed. Where are we? Right now, it's 75% know their status, 55% are on treatment, and 41% of the total number of the people living with HIV are virally suppressed. So if we break this out, and again, this is now just the Caribbean from the numbers I could get, and I'll give you two sets of numbers. So 64% of the HIV-infected population know their status, but of those, 81% of the people who know their status are on treatment, which is pretty good. That's a good linkage. Once they know their status, they're getting into treatment. And 67% of those on treatment end up being virally suppressed. So these are the numbers that you'll be officially seeing most of the time. What I show up here are sort of the depressing numbers. You need to know both sets. And here it's 52% of the entire HIV infected population in the Caribbean are on treatment. So 52%, but only a third of the entire HIV infected population are virally suppressed. So once again, that's got to get up to the magic number of 73%, but I'd like to see it even higher than that. And what is the challenge? Wafa made this slide, and I always think it's good to go back. For these are the challenges in delivering the promise of antiretroviral drugs. So one is we have to be more innovative in how we get people to know their status. And I heard this morning talking about home testing and other different ways. There's the late diagnosis of HIV, people coming in late initiation of ART, failure of the positives to get linked into care, and inability to achieve or to maintain viral suppression. Because we do worry about viral resistance in some of these cases. So let me go through a couple examples of how we need to address some of these. Before I do, I'm coming back again to that change in incidence. So what Deanna was talking about last night was right here. Latin America and the Caribbean lumped together, slight increase in HIV. And you saw that. It's level, but it's just a slight uptick. It turns out, if you really look at the Caribbean countries, look at this. You've really fantastic declines in HIV incidence. And again, part of that's because more and more people getting into therapy and programs. Everyone talks about Cuba being a great success story for mother-to-infant transmission, and it is. But it's not such a great success story when it comes to overall HIV incidence, and there needs to be a lot of work going on in that case. And part of that comes down to funding and the national recognition that we need to do more to getting diagnosis and linkage to care and to treatment. So these are the targets in terms of funding. These are realities over here, and you can see that there's a gap between these, and I always feel bad for Mark Dybul in the past trying to raise money for the Global Fund, and I worry about our Congress and our current president as to PEPFAR, but clearly your own countries are making up the difference and need to keep that response going. This is too busy of a slide. It's like a heat map. And I hate heat maps, but I thought I'd show one anyway. The immunologists know about a heat map, for the cytokines are all over the place. This is actually the 90-90-90 distribution by country. You can all look this up in the last report of UNAIDS that came out. Fascinating to look at your own country and how it's doing. I wanted to come back to a recent study that was actually announced in Durban a year ago. And it was called the ANRS, French study on treatment as prevention. And they randomized communities to getting immediately diagnosed and linked to care and put on treatment to get virally suppressed, and then standard of care in the other communities, whatever was going on in South Africa at the time. And it's interesting how the results turned out. So here are the control townships in the intervention, where they were doing a lot of home testing. Well, it turns out the incidence was not any different between the control standard of care versus the intervention. And they're going, well, what went wrong? Because here they were trying really advanced implementation to get people into care and virally suppressed. So there's no significant difference. We were all very disappointed by that study. So we all wanted to see what was the problem. And the problem is right here, that linkage to care was where it fell apart. So they really did well getting, even in the control villages, with 93% of the people knowing their HIV status, because they were doing rallies and soccer games and then getting tested for HIV. Where they failed in both arms of the study was linkage to care. And that seems to be the biggest obstacle to making this succeed over. So no significant difference in the incidence. Nearly all the individuals living with HIV were made aware of their diagnosis. 90% of those that got put on treatment were virally suppressed, another great success. The biggest problem was suboptimal linkage to care. And so more and more emphasis has been placed on that. And in fact, if you can get high retention, so you need to get them linked to care, but then the second part's retention in care. And in fact, these countries are doing quite well. These are all by region, that once you're linked into care and get put on therapy, retention's actually fairly decent. 84%, should be a little bit better, but not bad in terms of how to do that. So the next step was, can we even do better in terms of time to viral suppression? And a unique study was done in San Francisco, where they did testing in the emergency department and other places and got put on treatment same day. So they had emergency packs. And so if you were newly diagnosed with HIV, you were put on therapy that day, and then followed and linked into care and retention all taking place. And you can argue some of the pros and cons of this, but the bottom line is the sooner you're virally suppressed, the less infectious you'll be to your partners. And that's exactly what is being shown on this graphic. The percent with an undetectable viral load, if you were in the rapid arm, in terms of months, you were undetectable within 3 months, whereas the others doing universal ART after linkage to care, it was more like a year to getting virally suppressed. And if you did CD4 guided, it was even worse. So take-home point here was to really get people onto treatment as fast as possible. But treatment as prevention is not the only way to go. It's probably the most important, but combination prevention is equally important for those that remain HIV negative. And I don't have time to go through all these, but all of you are aware of all the different ones. Thank you very much. This is the end of the talk, pretty much. I wanted to say we are fast-tracking to the end of AIDS. You saw that from mother to infant transmission, especially for this region, hopefully for other places as well. But this is what we need to do. Much more aggressive HIV testing. Think of all the different innovative ways that CCAS and others can advocate for. Then, how fast can you get them into therapy? What are the pros and cons of that? Once a person's told they're positive, how quickly will they accept treatment? How quickly can you get them into treatment? And then for those who remain negative, PrEP. And we talked about PrEP earlier on this morning. With those caveats, we really can go back to start talking about an AIDS-free generation. I believe it for mother to infant transmission. I honestly believe we can hit those targets that have been set up for us and hopefully be able to minimize the overall impact of AIDS in our society. So thank you very much. 2 minutes over, not too bad.
We have time for a few questions. I have one. Why it took so long from the moment you present your slide on high viral load and transmission to arrive to treatment as prevention? It takes more than 10 years.
Well, so my study was an observational study, and Sten's going to show his observational study. They were back to back, came out simultaneously, really, and Sten and I advocated. We need to be treating people right away. There is always, I have the same data for male circumcision in Africa that we saw. If a man was circumcised, he was less susceptible to HIV. True in Africa. Everyone said, yeah, but that's got so many other factors involved. Could be cultural, could be something else. You got to do a randomized trial to really prove circumcision can decrease transmission. So we did it, and we got the same results, a 50 to 60% reduction. The same was true with viral load. There was the scientific community that felt very strongly we needed to do a randomized trial. Everyone was using CD4s of 350. The funding for going to everyone was not quite there. We had to convince the policymakers that provide the funding to treating everyone with scientific evidence that you could not argue. And that's 052. No one can argue the results. It's gone through the mill, and it works. And Sten will comment a little bit more about that in his talk. So that's why it took a while. It took a long time to do 052.
And it's still not accepted that much that undetectable equal non-infectious.
Yeah.
In many countries.
Clive.
Rajan Thoma was our first distinguished speaker, and he's had more experience than anybody about interpreting my titles, which most people go, what does he mean? But you see, you asked the question. Was anyone listening? You know, you made your study in 2000.
Yeah.
And really, you know, we're now 17 years later. Okay.
Don't remind me. Right then.
I just wanted to go to the results from the Caribbean.
Yeah.
I totally agree with Cesar that, you know, results from the Caribbean are hard to come by. Many of our smaller countries actually do not have adult prevalence rates. They're just not known. And so I do always kind of question, even for Barbados, which is meant to have some of the best data, you know, how sure are we about that first indicator?
Yeah.
Is it really 90%, or is it 84%, or is it 60%, or is it 50%? You know, I always wonder, you know, how sure can we be of that? And of course, everything else follows from that.
Yeah, it does. So we, great point. It's really a comment than a question. I can tell you, working in Baltimore, so we go into our emergency department and we do blinded serosurveys, totally blind. I don't know who the individual is. And there's a whole ethic issue about that. But we do learn from that what is our number of HIV infected people in our population. So then we went to see what
No, it's a fantastic strategy, just completely blinded,
Yeah.
you know, looking at your A&E department. I don't think we do that here, right?
There was a ethical argument that if you're going to do HIV testing, even if it's blinded, you need to go and let that person know. So the way we handled the ethics part was we offer HIV testing in our emergency department. And if they say, no, I don't want to be tested, it still goes into the blinded serosurvey. So it's not like we're denying HIV testing. They can get it done. And we have rapid tests, we have kiosks, and we go to great lengths. But then what we did was we took all those HIV positive people and we surveyed their blood for the presence of ARVs. So it's a mass spec, and and it told us what % of the positive people were virally suppressed. Were on ARVs. And then the last was we ran it for viral load.
Yeah, sure.
So we actually, in that population, we know what our 90-90-90 is. And then we have a cross-sectional incidence assay that Bharat has pioneered, and we apply that on all the positives. We actually know what the incidence has been over a 20-year period. So you theoretically can accomplish this as long as you get it through the IRBs and everything else.
Yeah.
It's very interesting.
Send me your IRB. That sounds great.
Yeah.
Thank you for your presentation. You're very animated. I appreciate that.
Yeah. Have to do that after lunch.
So my question is about the second 90
Yeah.
and how it compares. So do you know if that percentage of persons on treatment, what CD4 is that based on? Is that based on treat all? Is that based on 500? Because then how comparable is the data between countries?
So if I understand the question, in the second 90, the second 90 is, it's not based, it's all HIV positives.
Right.
It's saying 90% of all the people you have identified as HIV positive should be on treatment.
Right.
That has nothing to do with the CD4 count. So it's independent of that. It's 90% of the people that you've identified as infected should be on treatment. And then 90% of those people on treatment should be virally suppressed
But
with
then
time.
our treatment criteria are different.
This is implying, Cesar, is he around? It truly is implying independent of CD4. They're saying everyone. So if you're in a country and you have 1,000 HIV infected people, okay, 90% of those, or 900, should know their HIV status.
Right.
90% of those 900, or 810 people, should be on therapy. So it just disregards CD4.
Because the objective is to eradicate HIV, so it's viral load.
Yeah, and then 730 people should be virally
So
suppressed.
then are 810 actually going to be on treatment, or is that based on your eligibility?
No.
You're just saying based on treat all, 90% of those should be on treatment, so it's comparable across
Yeah,
the board.
yeah, it's the total number. So if you're coming from somewhere where only people with a CD4 less than
Last two
350, that would be a problem.
Two fast questions.
Fast questions.
Good afternoon, Judy Nesbitt, Nevis. I want to first
Yeah.
apologize for the lack of data for St.
Yeah.
Vincent Nevis, but we do treat at 500 and less,
Oh, okay,
and moving towards treating all with our new guidelines that are coming out soon.
yeah.
But the question is, with you being equal to you, undetectable being equal to uninfectious, what do we now advise our serodiscordant couples who want to become pregnant?
Yeah. So if we really believe U equals U, and the individual's virally suppressed, in the peripheral blood they have less than 100 copies, 200, whatever your cutoff is, they are in essence not infectious, and they can move forward with pregnancy.
It's the Switzerland statement. It's the Switzerland statement since 2008.
I will add one more comment to it, though, that I often advise our couples, and that is if, the individual's not real adherent to their treatment and you're worried that they might not remain uninfectious, but you still want to get pregnant, there is PrEP. The PrEP will protect against acquisition of HIV. The treatment is preventing transmission. If you want to prevent acquisition as well, and there's a question of reliability on treatment, then I put them on PrEP. Because if they want to get pregnant, it's condomless sex, let's face it. So you go from that perspective. But I think they can move ahead
Last
with
question.
pregnancy no matter what.
Last question.
Yeah, last one.
Okay, I'll be very quick. My name is Clement George, and right now I'm from the University of the West Indies at Cave Hill, formerly from Toronto. Anyway, I'm really interested in your work, and some of my work that I've been doing in the Bahamas is actually based on yours. So in terms of male circumcision, can you tell us a little bit more what you think in terms of the possibility of male circumcision as a prevention tool right here in the Caribbean?
Well, my experience has all been in Africa completely, so I can't comment directly to the Caribbean. But I will tell you one study. We've presented this before. It's pending publication. I'm very excited about it. But it turns out in Uganda, where we got circumcision up to close to 70% of the male population being circumcised, we got close to 70% of people who were infected on ARVs getting virally suppressed. We saw a massive decline, significant rate, decline in incidence. I call it combination prevention. It's treatment as prevention, it's circumcision. And then, because we have it's a cohort, it's called the Rakai cohort, we actually could look and see, do men who are circumcised have a greater decline in incidence than the men who remain uncircumcised? And the answer is yes. The incidence is going down slightly more rapidly in the circumcised men. It was very interesting. We then looked at the women. And is there a factor that influences the decline in incidence in women? And guess what the answer is on that? It's not whether the man was circumcised or not, because that has nothing to do with transmission. It was whether her male partner was on treatment and was virally suppressed. Comes back to U equals U. So very important study that I'm waiting for its publication. And I can't comment on circumcision here in the Caribbean. you folks are more the expert on that. I'd love to hear from all of you.
Thank you very
Thanks.
much, Dr. Quinn.